There are moments when exhaustion doesn't look dramatic. You still answer messages. You still show up to work. You still make small talk and say, "I'm fine." But internally, something feels worn down, not broken, just tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. You wake up already overwhelmed by the day ahead. Before the day has even started, your mind already feels crowded. You think about responsibilities immediately. Things you forgot. Things you still need to do. Conversations you're avoiding. Problems you still haven't solved. And sometimes, you don't even know what's making you so tired anymore. That's the frightening part. When mental exhaustion lasts long enough, everything starts blending together. The stress becomes so normal that you stop questioning it. You stop asking yourself whether you're okay, because surviving the day becomes the only priority. Simple things begin feeling strangely difficult. Replying to a message feels draining. Cleaning your room feels overwhelming. Even choosing what to wear can feel mentally exhausting because your mind has no energy left for decisions. And yet, people around you may never notice. You still laugh at the right moments. You still complete tasks. You still try to be dependable. But inside, you feel emotionally distant from yourself. Sometimes, you sit in silence and realize you haven't truly relaxed in months. Your body is sitting down, but your mind keeps running. Thinking, remembering, worrying, preparing for problems that haven't even happened yet. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And sometimes, exhaustion becomes one of those distractions. Not intentionally, but constantly staying busy can prevent people from noticing how deeply overwhelmed they've become. You tell yourself you'll rest later. You tell yourself things will calm down eventually. You keep pushing forward because you feel like you have no other choice. But the mind keeps track of everything you ignore, every disappointment you brushed aside, every emotion you suppressed to stay functional, every moment you forced yourself to keep going when you were already empty. Eventually, your inner world starts asking for attention. Not loudly at first, quietly, through lack of motivation, through emotional numbness, through irritation over small things, through feeling disconnected even in rooms full of people. And one of the loneliest feelings in the world is realizing you don't even recognize your own exhaustion anymore, because it has become your normal. You miss the version of yourself that felt lighter, the version that could focus, the version that could enjoy small moments without feeling mentally elsewhere. But even now, underneath all this exhaustion, you are still there, buried beneath pressure, buried beneath survival mode, buried beneath the constant demand to keep functioning, no matter how tired you become. And sometimes, the first step is not fixing everything. Sometimes, the first step is simply admitting this. I have been carrying too much for too long. One of the hardest parts about emotional exhaustion is that life usually doesn't stop when you're struggling. The alarm still rings in the morning. People still expect things from you. Work still needs to be done. Messages still need replies. Responsibilities keep arriving, whether your mind can handle them or not. So you learn how to function while exhausted. You learn how to smile during conversations, even when you barely have energy to think. You learn how to say, "I'm just tired," instead of explaining how emotionally overwhelmed you really feel. You learn how to keep moving, even when every part of you wants to disappear for a while and rest. And after enough time, this becomes your normal. You stop asking yourself whether you're okay. You only ask yourself whether you can make it through the day. That's how many people quietly drift into survival mode. Not because they're weak, because they feel like they don't have permission to fall apart. There's this silent pressure to keep functioning, no matter how drained you become, to stay productive, to stay available, to keep showing up for everyone else, even when you can barely show up for yourself. And eventually, you begin measuring your worth by how much you can endure. If you're still working, you tell yourself you must be okay. If you're still handling responsibilities, you convince yourself your exhaustion isn't serious enough to matter. But functioning and healing are not the same thing. A person can continue working while emotionally falling apart inside. A person can look calm while mentally overwhelmed every single day. Some people become so used to stress that peace starts feeling unfamiliar. When things finally become quiet, they don't know how to relax anymore. They sit down to rest, but guilt immediately appears. Their mind starts listing unfinished tasks. They feel lazy for slowing down, even though they've been exhausted for months. And the painful part is that many people praise this behavior. They call you responsible, strong, reliable. But nobody sees the emotional cost of constantly forcing yourself to keep going. Nobody sees how tiring it is to carry pressure every day while pretending you're handling it well. Sometimes you become so emotionally tired that even small things feel heavy. A short phone call feels overwhelming. A crowded room feels unbearable. One more responsibility feels like too much. But instead of compassion, you criticize yourself. Why can't I handle things like I used to? Why am I so tired all the time? Why does everything feel harder lately? What many people don't realize is that emotional exhaustion changes the way the mind experiences everyday life. When your inner world has been under pressure for too long, even ordinary tasks can begin feeling emotionally expensive. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But before people can grow, they often need to admit something honest to themselves. Constantly surviving is not the same as truly living. And sometimes, strength is not pushing yourself harder. Sometimes strength is recognizing that your mind, your emotions, and your body have been asking for care for a very long time. There's a very quiet kind of sadness that comes from feeling disconnected from yourself. Not because one terrible thing happened overnight, but because, little by little, stress, pressure, disappointment, and exhaustion slowly changed you. And one day, you suddenly realize you don't feel like the person you used to be anymore. You remember a version of yourself that felt lighter, a version that laughed more easily, a version that had patience, curiosity, energy, and hope. Now everything feels heavier. Conversations feel draining. Your thoughts feel slower. Even moments that are supposed to make you happy don't reach you the same way anymore. Sometimes people around you notice the change before you do. You've been quiet lately. You don't seem like yourself. You used to be so excited about things. And even if they mean well, those words can hurt, because deep down, you already know. You know something inside you feels distant. You start missing old versions of yourself, the version that could focus, the version that enjoyed small moments, the version that didn't feel emotionally exhausted all the time. And what makes this even more painful is that you may not fully understand when the change happened. Life just kept moving. Responsibilities increased. Stress piled up. Disappointments stayed unresolved. You kept forcing yourself to function while silently becoming more disconnected inside. Until eventually, surviving became more familiar than feeling alive. Sometimes this grief appears in ordinary moments. You listen to music you once loved, but it no longer affects you the same way. You spend time with people you care about, but part of you still feels emotionally absent. You look at old photos and barely recognize the person smiling in them. Not because you hate who you are now, but because you miss feeling emotionally connected to life. And many people feel ashamed admitting this. They think they should just snap out of it. They compare themselves to others who seem more motivated, more energetic, more emotionally stable. But emotional exhaustion has a way of slowly dimming people from the inside. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That matters because exhaustion can make you believe your current state is permanent. It tells you this numbness is your identity now. It convinces you that the tired version of yourself is all that remains. But exhaustion is not your personality. Burnout is not your true self. Emotional heaviness is not who you are forever. Sometimes you are simply someone who has carried too much for too long, without enough rest, support, or space to breathe. Anyone would begin to feel lost under that kind of weight. And maybe healing does not begin with becoming the old version of yourself again. Maybe healing begins with meeting the version of yourself that exists right now with honesty instead of criticism. Because even if you feel disconnected from yourself today, the real you has not disappeared. That person is still there beneath the stress, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the pressure of trying to hold everything together. And slowly, with care, patience, and honesty, you can begin finding your way back again. When people become mentally and emotionally exhausted, they often begin pulling away from others without fully realizing it. Not always physically, emotionally. You still respond sometimes. You still show up when necessary. You still try to care. But inside, it feels like you no longer have the energy to fully connect. Conversations that once felt easy now feel draining. Replying to messages starts feeling like another responsibility. Even spending time with people you love can feel emotionally overwhelming when your mind is already overloaded. And this can become incredibly confusing, because part of you wants connection. You want support. You want to feel understood. But another part of you wants silence, space, distance from everything. So you begin disappearing in small ways. You take longer to answer messages. You avoid calls. You cancel plans because you feel too emotionally tired to interact. And then the guilt begins. You feel guilty for withdrawing, guilty for not being emotionally available, guilty for not showing up the way you used to. Sometimes people misunderstand your distance. They think you no longer care. They think you've changed. They think you're becoming cold or uninterested. But emotional exhaustion often has nothing to do with a lack of love. Sometimes your mind is simply carrying so much that even basic interaction feels heavy. You may notice yourself zoning out during conversations, not because you don't care about the person speaking, but because your brain feels exhausted from constantly processing stress. Even small social interactions can begin feeling emotionally expensive. A simple question can feel overwhelming. A crowded room can feel mentally exhausting. Too much noise, too many opinions, too many expectations, and suddenly your mind just wants to shut down for a while. Many emotionally exhausted people secretly feel lonely while also avoiding connection. That contradiction hurts. You isolate yourself because you're drained, but isolation eventually deepens the sadness. So you end up trapped between needing people and not having the emotional energy to be around them. Carl Jung once said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." And emotional exhaustion often makes communication feel almost impossible. How do you explain a tiredness you cannot fully describe? How do you explain that nothing terrible happened today, yet you still feel emotionally overwhelmed? So instead, many people stay silent. They say, "I'm okay. I'm just busy. I'm just tired," because explaining the truth feels too exhausting. And over time, you may start feeling emotionally invisible. You sit with people, but still feel alone. You laugh during conversations while internally feeling disconnected. You begin wondering if anyone truly notices how much you're struggling beneath the surface. But your distance does not make you a bad person. Sometimes emotional withdrawal is what happens when someone has spent too long carrying stress without enough support, rest, or understanding. Your mind begins protecting itself the only way it knows how, by reducing emotional stimulation. That's why even caring can start feeling tiring. Not because your heart disappeared, not because you stopped loving people, but because exhaustion quietly reduced your emotional capacity. And maybe the goal right now is not forcing yourself to become endlessly available again. Maybe the goal is learning how to reconnect slowly, honestly, and without pretending you're less tired than you really are. Some of the most emotionally exhausted people are the ones who are hardest on themselves. From the outside, they may seem responsible, disciplined, dependable, or ambitious. But internally, they are constantly pushing themselves beyond their emotional limits. Nothing ever feels like enough. Even after finishing something difficult, their mind immediately moves to the next problem, the next responsibility, the next expectation. There's rarely a moment where they truly allow themselves to rest without guilt. And over time, this creates a painful way of living. You begin treating yourself like a machine instead of a human being. You expect yourself to keep functioning no matter how overwhelmed you feel. You criticize yourself for being tired. You feel guilty for slowing down even when your mind is clearly exhausted. And eventually, your inner voice becomes exhausting too. You should be doing more. You're falling behind. You're wasting time. Other people handle this better. What makes self-pressure dangerous is that it often sounds responsible at first. You tell yourself you're just trying to improve, trying to stay productive, trying not to fail. But when every moment of your life becomes tied to performance, peace slowly disappears. You stop enjoying things fully because your mind is always focused on what still isn't done. Even during rest, guilt follows you. You sit down to relax, but your thoughts won't stop racing. You try to take a break, but you feel undeserving of it. You finally finish one task and immediately feel anxious about the next one. Your body may be resting, but your mind never truly feels safe enough to stop. And after a while, you don't even notice how cruel you've become to yourself. You speak to yourself in ways you would never speak to someone you love. You judge your exhaustion. You shame your mistakes. You treat your emotional limits like personal failures. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Because many people build their entire self-worth around achievement and endurance. They believe they must always be strong, always capable, always productive. So when exhaustion appears, they don't respond with compassion. They respond with self-criticism. Instead of saying, "I've been carrying too much," they say, "I need to try harder." And this creates a cycle that slowly drains people emotionally. The more exhausted they become, the more pressure they place on themselves. And the more pressure they carry, the more disconnected they become from their own needs. Sometimes the pressure comes from childhood experiences. Sometimes it comes from fear of disappointing people. Sometimes it comes from spending years believing your value depends on how useful you are to others. So resting begins to feel uncomfortable. Slowing down feels unsafe. Doing nothing feels like failure. But human beings were never meant to function endlessly without emotional care. Eventually, the mind begins asking for attention. Through burnout, through anxiety, through numbness, through the feeling that no matter how much you accomplish, you still feel empty inside. And one of the saddest parts of constant self-pressure is this. You can spend your whole life trying to earn the right to rest, instead of realizing you needed rest all along. You do not have to prove your worth through exhaustion. You do not have to destroy yourself just to feel valuable. Sometimes healing begins the moment you stop asking, "How much more can I force myself to carry?" and start asking, "Why have I been treating myself like I don't deserve kindness?" Sometimes emotional exhaustion does not arrive loudly. It doesn't always appear as a breakdown or a dramatic moment where everything suddenly falls apart. Sometimes it arrives quietly, so quietly that you barely notice it at first. You just start feeling a little more tired than usual, a little less patient, a little more distracted. And because life keeps moving, you tell yourself it's temporary. You think, I just need more sleep. I'll feel better after this week. Things will calm down soon. But weeks pass, then months, and slowly, exhaustion begins showing itself in small, ordinary moments. You reread the same sentence over and over because your concentration keeps disappearing. You walk into a room and suddenly forget why you went there. You open your phone to do something important and end up staring at the screen, mentally frozen. Even small decisions begin feeling strangely heavy. What should I eat? Should I reply now or later? Can I handle one more responsibility today? Things that once felt easy suddenly require emotional effort. You may also notice yourself becoming more irritated. Small inconveniences feel bigger than they used to. A delayed message, a change of plans, someone interrupting your quiet moment. And afterward, you may feel confused by your own reaction. Why am I so emotional lately? Why is everything bothering me? But exhaustion changes how much emotional energy you have available. When your mind has been overloaded for too long, even small frustrations can feel overwhelming. Sometimes, exhaustion looks like procrastination. Not because you're lazy, because your mind feels overloaded. You know something needs to be done, but starting feels impossible. So you delay it. Then feel guilty for delaying it. Then feel even more overwhelmed. And the cycle repeats. Sometimes it looks like emotional numbness. You stop getting excited about things you once enjoyed. You stop feeling present in conversations. You go through entire days without fully feeling connected to what's happening around you. Other times, it looks like emotional unpredictability. You feel completely fine one moment. Then, suddenly, overwhelmed the next. You cry unexpectedly. You feel irritated without fully understanding why. You feel emotionally sensitive over things that normally would not affect you so deeply. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And before people can heal, they often have to gently notice what their exhaustion has been trying to say, because the mind usually whispers before it starts shouting. It whispers through forgetfulness, through mental fog, through exhaustion that sleep does not fix, through losing patience faster than usual, through feeling emotionally distant from yourself. You may stop enjoying things you once loved. You may begin avoiding people, not because you dislike them, but because interaction feels emotionally expensive. You may feel tired even after resting. And perhaps the hardest sign to notice is this. You stop recognizing how overwhelmed you are because struggling has become your normal. You convince yourself this is just adulthood, just responsibility, just life. But carrying too much for too long changes people. It slowly steals energy, focus, joy, patience, and emotional presence. Not all at once, little by little. And sometimes healing begins with something very simple: paying attention, noticing the small signs instead of dismissing them, asking yourself honest questions. When was the last time I truly felt rested? When was the last time I felt emotionally present? How long have I been carrying all of this alone? Because exhaustion does not always need dramatic proof to matter. Sometimes the quiet signs are already telling the truth. You have been carrying more than your mind was ever meant to hold by itself. Many emotionally exhausted people have spent so much time taking care of responsibilities, expectations, and other people's needs that they slowly stopped paying attention to themselves. Not intentionally. It happened little by little. You became the reliable person, the understanding person, the person who keeps going no matter how tired they are. And after a while, you stopped asking yourself an important question: what do I need? Because survival became more important than self-connection. You learned how to ignore your exhaustion, ignore your emotions, ignore your limits. You told yourself you would rest later. You told yourself other people needed you more. You convinced yourself that pushing through everything was strength. But constantly abandoning yourself has a cost. Every time you say yes when your mind is begging for rest, you feel it. Every time you stay silent about what's hurting you, you feel it. Every time you force yourself to tolerate things that emotionally drain you, a part of you becomes more disconnected. And eventually, you begin feeling invisible, even to yourself. You may know how to care for everyone else, but not know how to care for your own emotional needs anymore. You know how to be useful. You know how to be dependable. You know how to keep functioning while exhausted. But you may not know how to pause without guilt. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." And looking inward can feel uncomfortable at first, because once you become honest with yourself, you start noticing how much pain you've been minimizing. You notice how often you silence your feelings to avoid conflict, how often you overextend yourself to avoid disappointing people, how often you ignore your emotional exhaustion because you believe everyone else's needs matter more than your own. Many people think self-abandonment only happens in dramatic situations, but often it happens quietly. It happens when you constantly dismiss your own feelings, when you keep pretending you're okay because you don't want to burden anyone, when you continue carrying emotional weight long after your mind has reached its limit. And over time, this creates deep emotional loneliness. Because even when people are around you, you still feel unseen. Not because nobody cares, but because you stopped expressing what's really happening inside you. Sometimes you become so focused on maintaining peace around you that you create chaos within yourself. You keep absorbing stress, keep tolerating exhaustion, keep neglecting your emotional needs, until one day your mind no longer knows how to keep carrying everything quietly. And this is where many people misunderstand healing. They think healing means becoming stronger, becoming more productive, becoming emotionally unaffected. But real healing often begins with honesty. Honesty about what hurts. Honesty about what's draining you. Honesty about the fact that constantly sacrificing yourself is not sustainable. Healing also begins with smaller choices than people expect. Saying, "I can't handle this right now." Taking a break without apologizing for it. Allowing yourself to disappoint people occasionally instead of constantly disappointing yourself. These moments may seem small, but emotionally, they matter deeply. Because every time you listen to your limits instead of ignoring them, you rebuild trust with yourself. Every time you acknowledge your exhaustion instead of criticizing it, you create space for healing. And maybe that's what many emotionally exhausted people truly need. Not more pressure. Not more guilt. Not more expectations. But permission. Permission to stop pretending they are endlessly strong. Permission to stop carrying everything alone. Permission to finally treat themselves with the same care they so freely give to everyone else. Because you cannot heal while constantly abandoning the person who is hurting the most, yourself. A lot of people believe exhaustion is only physical. So when they start feeling mentally drained, they tell themselves they just need more sleep. A weekend off. A short break, a vacation. And sometimes those things do help. But there are moments when you rest your body and still wake up exhausted inside. That's the confusing part about emotional exhaustion. You can sleep for hours and still feel heavy when you wake up. You can spend an entire day doing nothing and still feel mentally tired. You can take time away from responsibilities, yet your mind continues carrying the same pressure. Because not all exhaustion comes from lack of rest. Some exhaustion comes from constantly holding emotions in, from overthinking every situation, from pretending to be okay for too long, from carrying stress your mind never had the chance to process. And when emotional pressure builds for months or years, simple rest is sometimes not enough to fully restore you. Your body may pause, but your mind keeps running. You lie in bed, yet your thoughts continue replaying conversations, responsibilities, worries, regrets, and unfinished problems. Even moments that are supposed to feel peaceful can feel emotionally restless. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And many people do not realize how much hidden emotional weight they are carrying every single day. Pressure they normalized, stress they stopped questioning, pain they pushed aside because life demanded they keep functioning. Eventually, that emotional weight begins showing up everywhere. You lose motivation. You feel disconnected from yourself. You feel emotionally numb or unusually sensitive. You stop enjoying things the way you once did. And because these feelings are invisible, people often try to fix themselves by resting physically while ignoring what's happening emotionally. But emotional exhaustion usually asks for more than sleep. Sometimes it asks for honesty. Honesty about what is draining you, what keeps hurting you, what you've been tolerating for too long. Sometimes rest does not work because the environment you return to is still overwhelming. You take one day off, then immediately return to constant pressure. You finally relax for a moment, then your mind fills with anxiety again. It becomes difficult to recover when your nervous system never truly feels safe enough to soften. Some people are not only tired from doing too much, they are tired from being emotionally on all the time, always thinking, always worrying, always anticipating problems, always trying to stay strong. That kind of mental tension slowly drains people from the inside. And over time, you may notice something painful. You no longer remember what genuine rest feels like. Not distraction, not temporary escape, real emotional rest. The kind where your mind is not constantly preparing for the next stressful thing. And maybe this is why some people return from vacations still feeling empty. The location changed, but the emotional weight came with them. Because exhaustion is not always about needing to stop moving. Sometimes it's about needing to stop carrying so much internally. Healing may require boundaries, different routines, more honesty, more emotional support, more moments where you are not forcing yourself to perform strength every second of the day. And perhaps, most importantly, healing requires compassion toward yourself. Because many exhausted people secretly believe they must earn rest by completely breaking down first. But your exhaustion matters before you collapse. Your emotional pain matters before burnout becomes unbearable. You do not have to wait until your mind completely shuts down to finally admit, this is too much for me. Sometimes that admission is not weakness. Sometimes it is the beginning of finally listening to yourself after far too long. There comes a point where many emotionally exhausted people realize something painful. They know how to survive, but they do not know how to survive gently. They know how to push through exhaustion, how to ignore emotional pain, how to keep functioning while mentally drained. But they do not know how to continue living without constantly hurting themselves in the process. For a long time, many people confuse strength with self-neglect. They believe being strong means never slowing down, never needing help, never admitting something feels too heavy, so they keep carrying everything silently. Responsibilities, stress, pressure, emotional pain they never fully process. And eventually, they become so used to struggling that suffering starts feeling normal. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But choosing who you become also means choosing how you treat yourself while moving through difficult seasons of life. And many exhausted people have spent years treating themselves harshly. They force themselves to keep going without rest. They shame themselves for being tired. They expect themselves to function perfectly while emotionally overwhelmed. But constantly pushing yourself beyond your limits is not healing. It is survival at the cost of your inner well-being. Learning to keep going without destroying yourself begins with understanding something simple. You are a human being, not a machine. You cannot endlessly give energy you no longer have. You cannot constantly ignore emotional pain without consequences. You cannot keep abandoning yourself and expect peace to appear later. And yet, many people try. They continue saying yes when they are exhausted, continue carrying responsibilities they can barely manage, continue pretending they are okay because they fear disappointing others. Until one day, even small things start feeling impossible. Getting out of bed feels heavy. Replying to messages feels draining. Making simple decisions feels overwhelming. Not because they are weak, because they have been surviving in emergency mode for far too long. And maybe one of the hardest lessons in healing is realizing that rest is not laziness. Pausing is not failure. Having limits does not make you incapable. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is admit, I cannot continue living like this. Because real strength is not about how much pain you can silently tolerate. Real strength is learning when to stop hurting yourself in order to keep everyone else comfortable. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But becoming yourself is difficult when exhaustion has forced you into constant survival mode. When your entire life revolves around pressure, performance, and endurance, you slowly lose connection with your real emotional needs. You stop asking yourself what feels healthy. You only ask yourself what is necessary. And this is where healing often begins to change people. Not through dramatic transformations, through smaller, quieter decisions. Allowing yourself to rest before complete burnout. Taking breaks without punishing yourself emotionally afterward. Speaking honestly instead of pretending you can handle everything alone. Healing also means learning that productivity is not the same as worth. You do not become more valuable by exhausting yourself. You do not become more deserving of love by constantly overworking your mind and emotions. Some people spend years believing they must earn rest, care, and compassion. But you deserved those things long before you became exhausted. And maybe keeping going in a healthier way means changing the question entirely. Instead of asking, how much more can I force myself to carry? You begin asking, how can I care for myself while carrying this? That question changes everything. Because emotionally healthy perseverance is not about destroying yourself to reach the finish line. It is about learning how to move through difficult seasons without losing yourself completely along the way. And sometimes, progress looks smaller than people expect. Drinking water when you have neglected yourself all day. Going outside for a few minutes instead of staying trapped in spiraling thoughts. Answering one important message instead of avoiding everything. Allowing yourself one honest conversation instead of pretending you are fine. These small moments matter more than people realize, because exhausted minds rarely heal through pressure. They heal through consistency, gentleness, honesty, and care repeated over time. And if you are emotionally drained right now, maybe your goal does not need to be becoming perfect overnight. Maybe your goal is simply this: to stop treating yourself like someone whose pain does not matter. Mental and emotional exhaustion can slowly convince people that they have lost themselves forever. Not all at once, little by little. You stop recognizing your energy. Your motivation changes. Your emotions feel heavier. The things that once made you feel alive no longer reach you the same way. And after enough time, you begin wondering, what happened to me? That question hurts because deep down, you remember another version of yourself, a version that felt lighter, more hopeful, more emotionally present. You remember laughing more easily, feeling excited about small things, having the energy to imagine a future without immediately feeling overwhelmed by it. Now even simple days can feel emotionally exhausting. And sometimes you become afraid that this tired version of yourself is permanent. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That quote matters because exhaustion has a way of making people believe their current pain is their final identity. It tells you that this numbness is who you are now, that this heaviness will never leave, that you will always feel this disconnected from yourself. But exhaustion is not your true self. Burnout is not your personality. Survival mode is not your identity. Sometimes you are simply someone who has been carrying too much for too long without enough rest, honesty, support, or emotional safety. Anyone would begin to lose themselves under that kind of weight. And yet, even now, the real you is still there. Maybe quieter than before, maybe exhausted, maybe buried beneath stress and emotional overload, but still there. The part of you that wants peace is still there. The part of you that wants connection is still there. The part of you that still hopes life can feel lighter again is still alive, even if it feels distant right now. Sometimes, emotionally exhausted people become so focused on surviving that they stop noticing themselves completely. They stop asking what they feel, what they need, what they miss. Life becomes about responsibilities, pressure, and endurance. And while survival may keep you moving, it can also disconnect you from your inner life if you stay there too long. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." And slowly reconnecting with yourself often begins with very honest moments. Admitting you are tired instead of pretending you are fine. Admitting something hurts instead of minimizing it. Admitting you cannot continue carrying everything the same way anymore. Those moments are uncomfortable, but they are also healing. Because the moment you stop running from your own emotional reality, you begin creating space for change. And healing rarely happens dramatically. Usually, it happens quietly. You start noticing your limits instead of ignoring them. You begin speaking to yourself with slightly more kindness. You allow yourself to rest without constantly feeling guilty for it. Little by little, you begin rebuilding trust with yourself again. And perhaps one of the most important parts of healing is understanding this. You do not need to become the exact person you used to be. Many people exhaust themselves trying to go back to an older version of themselves. But life changes people. Pain changes people. responsibility changes people. Healing is not always about returning backward. Sometimes it is about becoming someone softer, wiser, more honest, and more emotionally aware than before. A version of yourself that no longer ignores exhaustion until burnout happens. A version that no longer measures worth only through productivity. A version that understands rest is necessary, not selfish. And yes, there will still be difficult days. Days where your mind feels heavy again. Days where old fears return. Days where exhaustion makes everything feel harder than it should. But healing does not mean never struggling again. Healing means you no longer abandon yourself during the struggle. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Not because suffering is something beautiful, but because growth often begins the moment people finally become honest about what they feel instead of constantly hiding from it. And if you are emotionally exhausted right now, this matters deeply. You are not failing because you are tired. You are not weak because your mind reached a limit. You are not broken because life has felt heavy for a long time. You are human, a human being who has been trying very hard to survive. And maybe, for now, you do not need to have your entire future figured out. Maybe you do not need to force yourself to become endlessly strong again overnight. Maybe the beginning of healing is smaller than that. Maybe it begins the moment you stop speaking to yourself like an enemy. Maybe it begins the moment you finally say, "I deserve care too." Because underneath all the exhaustion, all the pressure, all the emotional weight you have been carrying, the real you is still there, waiting patiently for you to stop treating your pain like something that must always be hidden just to keep going. If you have been mentally and emotionally exhausted for a long time, there is a chance you became so focused on surviving that you forgot something important. You were never meant to carry everything alone forever. Not every burden was supposed to become part of your identity. Not every painful season was supposed to convince you that exhaustion is simply who you are. Sometimes people become so used to being strong for everyone else that they stop noticing how deeply tired they have become themselves. They keep showing up, keep functioning, keep pretending they are okay because life continues moving. But hidden exhaustion has a way of slowly taking pieces of people, their peace, their energy, their ability to feel present, their connection to themselves. So if all you can do right now is take one small step toward caring for yourself better, let that be enough for today. One honest moment, one deep breath, one boundary, one act of kindness toward yourself. Sometimes healing begins that quietly, and sometimes that quiet beginning changes everything.